So I think that having seen what so doesn't work and what isn't helpful for children and for learners is what has made me all the more passionate about we have to advocate for inquiry and agency and self-regulation and critical thinking. Um, like that's what it's really about, not to let school or learning just become about standardized tests, or playing the game of school, but instead really being about real learning.
Hello and welcome to Blooming Curious, the podcast dedicated to reimagining early childhood education through the power of curiosity. We explore the strategies that inspire a lifelong love for learning in children. So if you're an educator or a curious parent looking for creative, meaningful ways to engage children and move beyond the talk and chalk traditional classroom approach, then this is the podcast for you. Today, I am very honored to be welcoming international education consultant and learning strategist, Tonya Gilchrist, to the podcast. Tonya specializes in helping schools around the world amplify inquiry and honor agency for deep learning and transfer across languages, literacies, and disciplines. Tonya works with schools to tailor professional learning just for their specific contexts and their unique needs. Tonya has enjoyed many years as an educator, instructional coach, and curriculum specialist. Tonya, it's such an honor and a pleasure to welcome you today to Blooming Curious.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I've really been looking forward to our conversation. So thanks for having me.
Probably not as much as I've been looking forward to having you. Listen, you're such a massive advocate for inquiry-based learning. What sparked your passion for inquiry?
That is a wonderful question. I think for sure, if we go back to just early life as a child, definitely I think I've always been a curious kind of person, so to speak. So I loved learning. I was one of those students that loved school, loved to learn new things, loved growing. So that, I think, natural curiosity and inquiry in that sense was always there. Always been a big reader. And of course, there's so much you learn through story in the world of books and imagination. So that was always living there. And though I think that as an educator, really, I guess two big things that sparked inquiry for me in the educational lens would be just my foundations as an educator in university. So I was blessed to have a wonderful academic advisor, and in the courses I took with her, she really advocated for what we often call workshop framework or a studio framework. So this idea that the bulk of your time is spent with children living the learning, out there really living it, not just being talked to about it. And that you then are coaching one-on-one, meeting with small groups, learning that just while in university then became that was just how you teach. Like I didn't know a different way. And I'm really grateful for that it was, of course, going to be a really inquiry-rich approach to teaching. So I carried that with me. And then I think the other big thing that kind of really ignited the passion further would be sort of unfortunate, but ended up being fortunate, is that I started off my career in the US. And at the time, things were really becoming incredibly big test focused, like standardized test focused. And as a teacher in the classroom, really teaching with inquiry-rich workshop approaches, relationships first, to have it all just become sort of this mindless march through published curriculum that every teacher needed to be doing the exact same thing in the exact same way, all for the sake of a standardized test at the end of the year. It was like soul crushing. And that's what actually moved me into the international teaching realm, as I was literally Googling, like, what else can I do? Because I can't keep doing this. Like, it doesn't align with my values. So I think that having seen what so doesn't work and what isn't helpful for children and for learners is what has made me all the more passionate about we have to advocate for inquiry and agency and self-regulation and critical thinking. Like that's what it's really about, not to let school or learning just become about standardized tests, or playing the game of school, but instead really being about real learning.
So you've worked now internationally for many years with international schools, and you said you moved because you wanted to move away from this whole testing base. So do you find that the international schools don't have such a heavy reliance on testing, or how are they different?
Well, definitely when I first moved overseas, definitely there wasn't that big reliance or over reliance, I would say, because of course it's not that, I think in an ideal world, I think standardized tests could have their place. Like I do think for equity and access, we want to ensure that all students are learning certain things, that we're not failing students, so to speak, that we know all third graders had access to learning these things about the world. Like that's great. It's just when it becomes this over reliance on just this one assessment and making it the be all end all. So I think when I first moved overseas, for sure, international schools at that time were quite different. And for me, it was exactly what I needed at the time, but with like this breath of fresh air and reinvigoration that you could have agency as an educator again. You could be creative, and yes, you still had your standards, the what that you needed to teach, but how you taught it, there was more flexibility there. I can say, to speak candidly, though, that I do feel that unfortunately, it does feel like more and more international schools right now are becoming more of what the U.S. was 10 years ago and are focusing more on standardized tests and are making that kind of the be all end all. And, in my heart, the part of my soul and heart are like, no, don't. Like of all the things to emulate, that's not it. I think to see that most students in the U.S. are not doing well. Like, it's not like we're outperforming other places in the world or something like that. So it's like, why do you want to emulate that system? It's not working. It's not actually helping learners grow. And we end up with a lot of young adults who haven't developed their critical thinking skills because, and at no fault of their own, they weren't given the opportunity, and they're not curious and they're not like lifelong learners and communicators and all these things. So it is unfortunate, but I have seen a shift, I'd say, in the past probably past 6-ish years of more and more and more push towards standardization, kind of more push towards so many things that don't work, rather than emulating the things that do work. So it does tend to be region-based, though. It's certainly not all international schools, but in certain regions of the world, that's been a big shift.
That's interesting. So inquiry often, I guess, disrupts, right, traditional teaching methods. It's something that people feel uneasy about. But for you, what assumptions do you think teaching and learning that educators do that they need to unlearn? Because they have this thing in their heads that inquiry doesn't quite cut it. That if they're going to do inquiry, well, I hate that whole thing about do inquiry because you don't actually do inquiry. But if they're going to become inquiry-based learning practitioners, something else is going to give. They feel perhaps that kids are going to lose out on stuff because they also, I think, very often feel that it means they have to give up on explicit instruction. So there's this assumption that they have. So what would you say to schools and administrators and teachers? How do they unlearn this so that they can make this shift to be, I guess, is what you've just described, which is actually so much better because we've seen that the alternative isn't working.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, there are so many misconceptions about inquiry-based learning and teaching, and you just unpacked, I think, the biggest ones there of that there's no explicit teaching inside inquiry. That's simply not at all true. In fact, so much of inquiry-based learning is about being intentional, like intentional design, intentional teaching. There's a beautiful quote lifted up from a research study from several years ago now that says in inquiry-based learning, explicit teaching occurs just in time, not just in case. And I love that. So I when I'm working with schools and teams, like we kind of lean on that as almost like a mantra in all that we do. We're like, are we being just in time or just in case? Because too often what we have to unlearn, so to speak, going back to your question, is the being just in case. Like a lot of times as teachers, we feel like, well, I better say one more thing just in case. I better like show them how to do this just in case. I better like do this for them just in case. And instead, like first letting them go off and give it a go. Trust them to try. Set up the kind of culture in your classroom where they're going to be figuring out kind of people, we'll often say. And so they'll go and they'll get to have some productive struggle and healthy challenge. And so much more learning comes from that than just someone else doing it for you, right? So I think that big idea of just in time, not just in case. However, if you see that a child has no idea what to do, you also don't know what you don't know. So there's also another great quote we lean on a lot that is an old proverb that says, you don't teach ducks how to swim by throwing eggs in the water, right? So we're not throwing eggs in the water, right? Like it's this beautiful, intentional equilibrium of just in time, not just in case. So you do explicitly teach. Of course, you have an important role as a teacher and as an activator of learning, but it's that you know that when you explicitly teach, you're doing it with intention, that you're like, they need, this is a skill or a strategy or an idea that they'll need to use again and again. I'm going to model this for them or teach them this, show them this. And then you let them then, of course, most importantly, apply it, right? Then they'll need to take whatever you did explicitly teach and actually get to still give it a go and be a figuring out kind of person and all those things, that it's not just you talking at them. So I think that's that shift. And kind of with that, I guess, would be sometimes helping teachers and coaches, coordinators, whoever it might be, think about how they've really learned. I find that often helps create a shift. It's like, when have you really learned something? How did you know you really learned it? And if you have them take a few minutes to reflect and even talk together about that, they realize, oh, all the things that they say they really know how to do, whether it's, surfing or baking or reading, writing, whatever, they're like, I had to actually do it. And I had to make some mistakes and I had to reflect. And it's like, that's inquiry. Like you had to ask questions, and, like that's the process. So I think those big pieces of asking and doing and thinking, or inquiry, action, reflection, like that's just how we learn anything. Like if I want to learn how to do a handstand, I'm going to be looking up like YouTube videos, reading books about it or what have you, tutorials. I'm going to inquire. Then I'm going to have to actually try it and do it and make mistakes and have reflective practice to get better and better to own the skill. So you have to like live it. And I think helping teachers and educators remember that, oh yeah, anything I truly learn, I had to live it. I guess there's a difference between covering and learning. And so that's the other big reminder, is we'll often talk about how learning doesn't happen outside of the learner. So you can feel like you're covering a lot. Oh, I covered this, we covered this, we covered this. And that can feel, I guess, safer, or feel like, I know I covered it. And so that's big learning. But actually, if they don't learn anything, like you covered it, but they didn't learn it because you get to actually live it. So yeah, I think a lot of that. And as you said so well earlier, that then they'll actually be able to do more. I know sometimes I'm giving parent workshops as well when I'm visiting schools. And just recently, I was at a school in Asia, and we had a parent workshop on inquiry-rich mathematics, and really helping parents see, it's not about rote memorization and doing like math facts as fast as you can. It's more about understanding the concepts of mathematics and being able to have that productive struggle and strategic thinking. And like we care way more about the thinking than the answer. And a parent came up at the end and was like, oh, this was great. And this is definitely what I want for my child. And she said, but, I still have to say, though, I am worried, though, like the reality is they have to take these tests and exams for like university. And like, what about the test? And I was like, well, but if they do the kinds of problems we just looked at together, because parents got to actually explore some of the students would do, math games they would play, things like that. It's like if they were doing this instead, they'd get to that problem on the test and it would be like no sweat for them, because the problem on the big assessment is just like kind of a rote they don't even have to think in the way that they had to think this whole year in math, so they'll get that to that assessment and be more than capable to do that kind of thinking. And, that really struck a chord with the parent. They're like, oh, yeah, of course. Like, I hadn't thought about it in that way, which is exactly kind of what you were saying, that no, you're not losing anything. Kids are still going to get that knowledge they need, the content knowledge, the background knowledge, the skill knowledge. It's that we're not going to stop there. They're going to get more than that with thinking skills they'll develop and the mindset and just the approach to learning, the stance to learning that they'll develop just as a person, as a human being.
Yeah.
So
I love how you said that we all learn by experience and by doing it. Because I've often said to people, think back about your own learning. You can't remember a thing you learned at school except the things, well, I do anyway. I only remember the things that were hands-on. I remember the things I did where I actually physically got involved and made something or was working on something physically using my hands. I don't remember anything else.
no, I know.
So,
Yeah.
And then the side of the coin is that if we know what worked and what didn't work for our own schooling, you can't replicate for others what you didn't enjoy or what didn't work for yourself. And I think we've grown up with a system, and then we get to stand in front of the class and then we try and replicate the way we were taught, but it didn't work, and we didn't enjoy it. And we had no agency and we don't remember anything. So I do think that we need to reflect on that and think, is what I'm doing really valuable? Is what I'm doing really working? Are children genuinely learning? Because it's interesting, the other day I saw a quote somewhere that said, just because children are engaged doesn't mean they're learning. So that kind of, I think they were talking about, just because you can see a child sitting at a desk filling in a worksheet or being quiet or they look as if they're working, doesn't actually mean that they're learning. And that really struck a chord with me too, because how often don't children just go through the motions perhaps, but at the end of the day, and we all did that. When you come to your university exams and stuff, you're cramming, and you're learning, and you're studying, and you do the exam. And then a day later, you don't even remember anything about the exam or what you learned. So I think and it's very often because you didn't get that hands-on experience to try it out and practice the skill. So that's very true. Tonya, there's another thing that I want to ask you. Is that another traditional teaching strategy is this thing about teaching in silos, where many educators all over schools are still very much teaching separate subjects. So they might have a literacy block, they might have a mathematics block, they might have then a block for science and a block for humanities, whatever it might be. And children don't really see the connection between subjects or the connection that they can make in their learning to something else. It's that whole application part of the equation that sort of falls flat. In your work that you've done in all these years, how have you helped teachers to identify meaningful connections that they can make between subjects so that they can design cross-curricular activities that break apart those silos where children can actually see the connection to other areas of their learning?
Yeah, I think there's several ways, as with many things, and as in inquiry folks, we know there's not one way. So there's actually a few different ways we often look at for this idea of authentic transdisciplinary learning or interdisciplinary learning. Because for sure, what we all have seen is either what you just mentioned, like silos, and there's no connections at all, or especially in a lot of international schools, what they've experienced is, okay, we're making connections, but they're like forced and fake. And they feel like, well, even the connections we try to make aren't actually working. So I think kind of two big things that help with both of those. One is, are we designing things that are really what we would call concept-based? Like truly concept-based, not just topic-based. And again, it doesn't mean you're getting rid of anything. You're still going to explore the topics you need to explore. Like, let's say you need to explore certain time periods in history or, a certain part of science like force and motion or light and sound or something.
Mm-hmm.
You need to teach that content. Like kids need to know things about the world. Those are wonderful things to know about. So that's not going anywhere. However, can you like put an umbrella or lens over that is truly conceptual? So big concepts like patterns, perspective, systems, function. If you truly make it about the concept, then children can make connections all across their day. And it's more about I'm learning about patterns in the world, not I'm learning just only about
Mm.
habitats or something. So, for example, I was working with a team that was in their system third grade. That would probably be like year three, I think,
Mm.
also system or year four. And they had a lot of science standards around weather. So initially, they had this whole weather unit they had designed, and it was about how we look for patterns inside weather to like make predictions, but it was still like all about weather. So instead, we just said, well, what if we just took the word weather out of our like central idea or big idea for the unit? Kids are still going to need to learn about weather, but what if your big idea was just that people look for patterns to form theories and make predictions? Because if we make it the pattern unit instead, now art can be involved, physical education can be involved because like patterns are everywhere. Maybe in
Mm.
PE, we're looking at patterns, I don't know, different team games, and the patterns you make in play or the patterns you make to form decisions together. You can see, or maybe it's a dance unit, just depends on what's happening at that school. And then in art, there's patterns in different art styles, different mediums, all sorts of things. And then in math, you could still be learning about your addition facts or multiplication facts and noticing the patterns within something times something is always an even number. Like, what does that mean? So then all across their day. And so we even designed this little for kids to do some assessment as learning, like some self-assessment. They had their own little sort of checklist, so to speak, of the big ideas about patterns. Like I can find patterns and use them to make predictions. And they saw how they started collecting evidence, the children themselves, of, in math, here's a place where I noticed a pattern and it helped me form a theory or prediction. In reading, I made a theory about a character. In PE, I made like we noticed a pattern here. And they were realizing that what they were learning was all conceptually connected. And that was way more powerful than something like if we'd kept it just about the topic, weather. Then PE teachers are trying to have kids, I don't know, build like a human snowflake, or music teachers are like sing a song about the seasons or something. And that's not really transdisciplinary learning. You're not going between, across, and beyond the disciplines, as we'll often say. Instead, you've just made a science unit. If the unit's only about weather, it's really not, transdisciplinary. It's a subject-specific unit, which has its place too, but it could be a missed opportunity. So I think that's a big one. Are our units truly conceptual? Have we helped design for truly conceptual connections? And then children are just living that conceptual understanding across their day, across their weeks. And then the other big thing would be how all disciplines, like if you think reading, writing, math, can be a vehicle for inquiry. So the other big way that we make connections is to think whatever we're studying, how will we use this as a vehicle? Literacy is a great example for this, definitely not the only example. But when you are studying something that's more science or social studies focused, do you have the children actually digging in and reading about it and writing about it? Because too often what we do is we do all the thinking for them, right? We take okay, we're looking about habitats. I'm going to make like some Google slides about habitats, bring kids together to the carpet, show them these important bullet points about habitats. Like, well, then you just did all the thinking for them. Like, why not give them age-appropriate article to read about habitats? So they have to do the thinking. They have to do the digesting. They have to do the figuring out and make sure it's interactive. They're discussing it. They're, like you said, they're not just engaged by staring at the paper. They're going to make their thinking visible. They're going to discuss and collaborate with others, but actually have them dig into the content where then you're doing reading and writing and speaking and listening and science or social science or what have you all at the same time because you're using it as a vehicle for inquiry.
That's really fabulous. Tonya, the other thing that I notice a lot of teachers ask is that with inquiry, they'll say, oh, But the kids are so interested. When we talk about being agentic, they say, well, how do I honor children's personal interests when they have their own concepts or units of inquiry or their own curriculum, whatever that is, to get through? And then you have a child coming in and they have their own interests. So very often they find it difficult, I think, to balance what they need to cover or what they need to do in a classroom situation with children's own interests. Do you have any advice for those moments of how we can honor children's own interests and at the same time continue with whatever it is that we're doing to meet our standards and outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot packed into that. So a few things would be kind of like with inquiry, there's lots of misconceptions about agency too. So agency doesn't mean just do whatever you want. I mean,
Exactly.
society would be kind of terrible if we all just did whatever we wanted, right? So I often lift up a quote from Edward Deasy, who spent like his life's work studying self-motivation and autonomy and agency. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he talks about how true autonomy is about relatedness. Like true autonomy is about considering others and the environment. And so I think for many schools, we use a common definition for agency. Definitely IB schools, for example, use the definition voice, choice, ownership. Um, and I think that's a great, concise way to define agency, voice, choice, ownership. However, I think a lot of times the ownership piece gets overlooked. And make no mistake, like choice and voice are key. And choice is like the gateway to really helping children exercise their agency. When we have choice, that's motivating. But it's almost like that's the low-hanging fruit. Don't want to think like, oh, I let kids choose what paper type they use today. So like agency done or something, like a checklist. Instead, it's like, that's great. Yeah, give them that choice. That's a good starting place. But going beyond that, like the ownership piece of our children actually exercising their self-regulation skills? Are they setting their own goals, monitoring their goals, self-assessing, self-adjusting? Like that's true agency. Are they considering their environment and the context and making sound decisions? So we'll often talk about how agency is actually when you're strong in both sound judgment and confident action, that you're not stuck in the zone of like learned helplessness where you just wait for someone else to do it for you,
Oh,
and
yeah.
like you can take confident action, but it's confident action with sound judgment. So children, like with anything, like any skill, once again, they need to live it, right? They need to practice making decisions and actually make some mistakes so that they become stronger decision makers. So one thing would be that just honoring agency in general, are you making space in your days and your weeks for kids to get time to make their own decisions and make mistakes and learn from that and self-assess and self-adjust, because that's where a lot of the true agency grows. That's what we want for them for life, that confident action with sound judgment. And then with all of that in mind, then thinking, okay, so yes, of course, you have certain standards that by the end of the year, children need to have experienced that content, that learning. So knowing that your inquiry can at times have a scope, right? But there's still so much opportunity for agency within that scope. So one go-to kind of practical lens, so to speak, is for teachers to think about what we'll often call the 5 W's and an H, like who, what, when, where, why, how. And that you always have the opportunity to give children agency in all of those things. And so certain times of year, it will be open scope. They get to choose all those things. Who are they working with? What are they learning? How, where will they sit? All of that. But at other times, it's maybe you're choosing 3 of those and children are choosing the others. Maybe the what has already been determined because of certain core standards that you're exploring right now. But children get to choose where they sit in the room. They get to choose how, like the how of how they're going to create or showcase their learning, what they're going to show. That's the agency lives inside there too. And that's where with many schools, we work on what's called universal design for learning. So this idea, UDL, would be that there's multiple means of engagement and multiple means of representation. So again, you might all be exploring migration, let's say, and that's something you want children to learn about and know about. but that they have lots of choice in how they will express what they learned. That's a big one for a lot of teachers to kind of open up space for, is that, yeah, your standard says this, but do children have to just show that they learned that by taking this one test or doing this one paper, or, not conflating? We often talk about, don't conflate like the goal with the means. The goal is they show understanding of this and this and this about migration, let's say. But there's so many different ways they could show that they learn. So do you open up space for that, even if, yes, at the end of the day, they need to, and we want them to learn this standard. So I think just thinking of the scope, also within kind of the when, sometimes opens up choice for agency of what students are interested in. Like in mathematics, we're often talking about adaptive math provocations or adaptive math stations. But by the end of like 2 weeks, every child has done every provocation, but they chose when to do it. And that sounds simple, but actually that's a big piece of like knowing, okay, these are core things I need to learn, but I have some agency in like what I feel like doing when, which one I want to do first. Like that's actually not a small thing, that's agency building. So starting where you're at and thinking, where can I open up more space for agency? Because it's living everywhere, but that it doesn't have to mean do whatever you want. Or maybe you're doing a book club unit. Can children have a choice? Okay, there's these 6 books to choose from. Go around to a gallery walk of all 6. Make a list of your top 3. You will get one of your top 3, and then that way you as a teacher can consider their social needs, their academic needs when forming book club groups, but you're also going to make sure they get one of their top choices that they're interested in. So I think just not feel like it has to be just a do whatever you want chaos. Like agency actually involves a lot of intentional design if we really want to help kids exercise their decision making. So I think those are a lot of the big pieces, and just kind of thinking through then, again, that the biggest piece of agency would be, if I look across a unit, where are children actually self-assessing, self-monitoring, self-regulating, that it's not us helicoptering it all or doing it for them, but letting them actually be the decision makers. And I think just a final thing to say, though, because I know a lot of teachers I work with, and it sounds like, going back to your initial question, this is something you've, heard a lot too, is when children are, of course, curious about something totally different than our standards, just there's go-to tried and true kind of tools that you can use, like having a sort of wonder wall or parking lot, so to speak, where like, okay, they have, that is such a juicy question. Add that to our wonder wall. And then maybe you just save some space like once a week, even once every 2 weeks if your schedule is really tight, where you have a chunk of time where then we're going to go back to our wonder wall and choose each child choosing one of the biggest things they want to take some time to explore. And you've maybe even helped activate that by curating a few possibilities of, books they can look at, things they can research, but that it doesn't have to mean that in that moment when they ask that question, you're going to derail all the learning for the whole class community and study this other thing for 45 minutes. Like some teachers are like, oh no, the child asked this beautiful question. We have to right now do that instead, when really that's not equitable for the community, because all the other second graders need to learn some other things right now. But having a kind of a ritual and routine where you can still make space for that question. And if they put their name and their wonder on the wonder wall, you can even be a real kind of activator for them, and then going to the librarian and asking, do you have some books around this? And just giving that child those things to look at, that in their independent reading time, they can explore that more. In their independent writing time, if you're doing an information unit, kind of what we talked about before, the W's and an H, like you might need to teach what information writers do, but they can write about any topic they want. Like the skills of an information writer, every child does not need to write about the same thing, but I would say they shouldn't be, instead let them write about whatever they want. So that would be a chance for them to explore some of the things from the wonder wall that they really want to learn about and teach others about, so just opening up space. Yeah.
That's really good practical advice, Tonya. And it really reminded me so much of my time in a classroom. And those are the kinds of things that I was doing. And I just got that feeling back. It was just so joyful to be in a room like that. I remembered with the year 2s, we have this change topic in science, growth and change. And generally you see the whole class does the life cycle of the frog or whatever it might be. And I just think, oh my gosh, that's just so boring.
Right.
Imagine if you've got 25 kids and you do 25 different life cycles. Instead of just learning about a frog, you get 25 opportunities to learn about different things. So to me, that was always so exciting because I learned new stuff about strange things that I'd never known about. And it was so, I guess, empowering for the children because they had choice in what the topic was, but it still met the outcome, but it was their own story. And the other thing that was always so beautiful is that you then also saw the real talents come out when you used to say to them, like you say, it's not a free-for-all, but you have little bits that you can offer them choice in, how they were going to show their understanding and their learning. And that was always so beautiful. Like you would get those kids, very academic kids who wanted to write the report and all that, and that's fabulous. But then you also got those kids that love to create. And so they would make models and then they'd have to present and do an oral presentation when they presented their model. And that was still the exact same outcome, but just in a different way. And I just found that brought so much positive energy to the classroom. And children saw that their ideas and their strengths were valued. And so that was always something that gave me this really warm and fuzzy feeling as an educator. And I think it was something that children also valued because they saw that their strengths were valued as well. And so I've always found really strongly that we need to give children those opportunities to diversify the learning and you can still meet the outcome. So
100%.
That's really, to me, as a teacher, that's just so joyful. And I just hope and wish that other educators can experience that joy as well, because I think that's what makes teaching worthwhile.
Exactly. And I think that's often a good, litmus test, so to speak. Certainly not the only way to know, but if you're feeling the joy as a teacher, as a member of that class community, I'm sure the children are feeling joy too. If we're feeling bored, they're probably feeling bored too. So remembering that, I think recently I was working with the team and the focus with them was writing. And we were talking about how if you're assessing student writing and it's all the exact same, but that's probably because we taught it in a formulaic way. If you teach a formula, they're just going to do the formula or the fill in the blank. But if you open up space, if you're studying mentor texts that show different ways of doing it, then you're going to get voice. You're going to get true communicators, true writers with craft because they're showing you their own way of expression rather than just a fill in the blank. And I think that can be applied to all the different disciplines, like we were saying with that UDL lens in mind, so to speak. I mean, you gave beautiful examples there that there's multiple ways to show what you know about a certain outcome or goal. A certain learning goal, there's so many different ways to show what you know. And if we open up space for that, then as a teacher too, it's way more joyful to experience. And even if there's things you need to assess, it's way more interesting. Like you said, you learn about so many different life cycles they learned and what they know. And so as a whole community of learners, you feel that. And I think from a bigger lens, that's sending a powerful message for them just as humans, that later in life, there's not one way to express yourself. There's not one way to show knowledge. There's not one way to have skill sets. I think that's a good perspective to carry with you. So I think there's a lot of power there beyond just the academic learning, so to speak. There's so much more that we're learning and teaching as well.
There's so much I hear, and even when I go onto things like Reddit groups, for example, I see so many people complaining that their students are disengaged, that they have apathy, that they are not just bored, but they're boring because they have no interest in learning. So for me, inquiry is the antidote, right? So do you have any practical advice for educators when they are faced with reluctant students? How do you bring them out? Do you have any advice that you've seen in your international schools and in your experience?
Yeah, I think it's also so fascinating in a way to see just what we do as humans. And I know a few years ago, there's a wonderful psychologist, Adam Grant. I definitely recommend all books. He's fantastic. And he was talking about how when he's digging into the research, we haven't actually lost our attention and focus as humans, because a lot of people complain not only about students, but about adults too, that we've like lost our ability to focus. And he said, actually, what studies show is if it's something we're interested in, we can still focus just fine. So that ability is still there. It's when something's horribly boring or like we don't want to do it that suddenly we can't focus at all. And so that's kind of it. It's like you said, it's if they're disengaged, it's for a reason. Like that should make us curious, rather than it making us frustrated. I think it should make us curious of like, why is that? Why are they not engaged in this? And often the answer is, yeah, we're not letting them live it. Like productive struggle feels good. Healthy challenge feels good. As the saying goes, the brain that does the work does the learning. So like who's doing the work? And we want that brains on engagement, that feels good. So I'd say, first of all, making sure that we're not just talking at children, we're not, and teens, like I work all the way up through senior year, and that at whatever age we're working with, we're not just talking at them. They're really experiencing, they have to dig in, they have to think, because that is engaging. It's pretty boring to not get to actually think and try and do and figure out. Those that are seeming if students are seeming very apathetic, again, it's probably what we would call learned helplessness. And I often say, emphasis on the word learned. They've learned it somewhere. And so whether it's at home, whether it's past school experiences and in earlier years, whether it's from us unintentionally, they've learned to just sit there and do nothing. Research has a beautiful term that's been around for decades now. It goes back to the 1970s, and it's called being a warm demander. And so I think that would be something really important for all listeners to keep in mind is, are we being warm demanders? And it talks about how for culturally responsive teaching, children need high expectations. They need what we'd call active demandingness. And when I say children, that's all the way up through teens too. And even as adults, we need that. We also need warmth, personal warmth. So like relationships first. That's not just fluff. Like research shows again and again, no significant learning without significant relationships. So build relationships with your students first. And from like a practical lens, one go-to tip would be to use what we call positive presuppositions. So presume positive things about all your students, and all means all. So when you're talking to them, for example, if you have a learner who maybe you feel always appears to be disengaged and apathetic, going up to them and being like, oh, so what's your plan? What will you try next? Instead of asking, do you have a plan? Right? Do you have a plan indicates like, I think you might not. Instead, presume that of course they do. They're the kind of learner who makes a plan. So you're like, what's your plan? And then they probably stop and think, oh, wait, and maybe they didn't have a plan at all. But because you asked it in that kind of way, they're like, well, I was thinking maybe I might. And they start to make a plan, Or what have you done when you've had this kind of problem before? You're just assuming they've done something before. They're strategic. They're a problem solver. Right. You can take any question. Or how did a conversation with your partner help you? You might even know as a teacher that you've kind of watched them with their partner and it has real meaningful partner talk. But instead of going up and being like, well, did you talk to your partner? Or why aren't you like talking well with your partner? Instead going up and just being like, how has a conversation with your partner helped you? And again, you'll kind of almost see the wheels turn and they're like, oh, well, actually, they did tell me that, and they start to become that figuring out kind of person because they see that you believe they are. At one time, actually, I was in Australia at a school, and we were in, I think it was year 5 class, I think. And, because I'll go in a lot of times when I visit schools, I'll go into the classrooms and teach, and like teachers get to observe me teaching. So I'll go in and teach with their students and just to see some inquiry practices in action. And I always intentionally look for kind of the hot spot, so to speak. Like I'm not going to go and just talk to the child who's clearly fully into it. I don't think that'd be as helpful for the teachers versus seeing like, let's work with all students in the room and show what's possible. So there were these two boys, and it was during what we would call a mini lesson. Like they were all down on the carpet. We were gathered together as a whole group. And I was having them turn and learn, like turn and talk together. And there were these two boys on the outskirts of the circle. You could tell they were kind of like, they were discussing. But you just could tell that they were kind of used to being on the outskirts and not doing as much. So I went over and asked them, like, "Ooh, what are you thinking?" And they paused and they told me what they thought. They kind of did the side smile at each other, with their adolescence, like, I guess we have to come up with something we were thinking. Um, and they said something, and I was like, oh, well, that's so interesting. And you could see the shock that I like value that I said what they said was interesting. Um, and then I asked them, I said, well, what's your names? And they told me their two names. And I said, could I share that with everyone else when we come back together in a moment? And they said, I'll never forget it. They said, well, I think they already know our names. I think everyone here knows them. They thought I wanted to share that. I'm like, no, I want to you thinking like what you, and that was though a sign to me that they don't often get asked to like, do you know what I mean? Like, I think they were just shocked that I was going to lift up their thinking. And you could see them sit a little taller when we brought everyone back together. And I was like, I was just talking with so-and-so and so-and-so, and they said something that I was like, I hadn't even thought of that before, and I lifted up what they said. And it was like, you like literally see them sitting up a little taller. And so all of that is to say, I think start with relationships and positive presuppositions and show them with that warm demander stance. Research says you have to earn the right to demand engagement and effort. As a teacher, you have to earn the right to demand engagement and effort. So I think showing that respect and honor and value, and then you can demand. Then when they want to just kind of not engage, you can be like, oh, well, if they say, oh, I'm finished, I'm like, oh, great. Show me, where you did this and that. And then they realize they haven't, and then they do it. So you're still holding them to high expectations, but it's because you've earned that right. And then I guess just what we talked about earlier, like where can you open up choice? Because that's so motivating. So again, if it's reading and you're looking at like a deep study of character, well, they could be reading any book with characters, right? They don't have to read the same book. Any book with characters, they can practice the skills you're teaching to analyze characters. So if they want to read this book that they love, more power to them. Like they should. There should be this joy. And same thing in information reading and writing. Same thing in art, if we're thinking across the disciplines, like in any discipline, you can find that space for where can they make those choices. And that's going to make them much more engaged as well. I think that's human, right?
That's excellent and really such practical and thoughtful advice. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we're coming to the end, but what I'd like to ask you is, can you share a time that you've helped educators transform their classroom? There's something that you can share with us that just shows how inquiry has transformed a teacher's and student life.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And you asking it just made me think, it kind of made my heart just fill, because I realized, wow, what a blessing for me that I can think, like, you can ask that. And I'm like, I can actually think of quite a few schools, and that's beautiful. Like, I hadn't really thought about that it's like, wow, what a gift. I feel so fortunate to be able to work with so many great educators who've jumped in and have transformed, because I think we can always outgrow ourselves, like myself included. I always want to be learning and growing and transforming. I think the biggest thing that's helped, so yes, I can share some examples and from multiple schools, and the schools where it's happened have been the schools where it wasn't just a one and done pursuit. I really see myself not just as a consultant, but as a strategist. So strategizing with schools, what are their needs? What are their values? And designing something often new just for them, or synthesizing things just for them. And then working together for several years, actually. So getting to make multiples to the school, really becoming a partner. Like we know each other well. And I've seen complete transformations of approaches where, like one school I work with, just wonderful teams and educators. And I've been working with them for going into, I think, our fourth year now, with like 2 visits a year, every school year, 2 on-site visits, even some online sessions in the midst of things too at times to kind of catch up and follow up. I'll Zoom in to like their team meetings and things every now and then. And it's like we really know each other. So you've built that trust. And I think that leads to that transformation too. But they've completely, like their whole approach to mathematics has changed from a more what we might call conventional approach to an inquiry-rich approach. And they are just full on living it, going from not really being sure what to do, feeling like they can just only teach math the way they learned it, which is very rote and conventional, to now designing their own rich math tasks and ensuring there's time for whole group, small group, and one-on-one experiences. And it's just completely different. Their time in mathematics looks completely different than it did. And with another school, same thing, like 3 years of partnership, but with them it was writing and reading, literacy. And with them, it was though kind of starting with an opposite lens, is they were pendulum swings work both ways, and they'd kind of swung. They approached me initially as a school community being like, we've kind of lost the idea of true inquiry being intentional. Like there's a lot happening that's just kind of every teacher's doing whatever they want, in the sense of there's not cohesion. We're not able to work together as a team. And kind of this misconception that explicit teaching can't happen in inquiry. So they actually needed help finding more equilibrium of like where and how can explicit teaching live, like in that just-in-time kind of way. How can we have like a scope and sequence so that there is equity for all learners, but still have our own agency as teachers and still ensure there's lots of space for curiosity and growth? And so seeing some teachers who at first were quite adamant, no, I don't want like inquiry, like from their lens, they passionately wanted it to be kind of do whatever you want, to then them coming to me, after even just the first year together, them being the one advocating because they'd seen the power of what their writers were doing and what their readers were doing and how much joy they had and how much growth they had. So just seeing that shift in individuals as well, I think was really powerful, where they can have a whole perspective change. And again, not that they weren't an incredible educator to begin with, because I can sincerely say they were, but they just had, I think sometimes, it's scary to try something new. It's scary to like break out and do something different. And so to see at first being a little resistant to then wanting to like have just on their own, like extra little calls together, checking in, sending pictures of what they're doing, sending, because they're seeing the power. So I think the biggest shift is when you see the change in the students, of course, like when you actually get to try it and you see it. And so for a lot of my visits, again, I go into classrooms and teach, and that's usually the biggest game changer, so to speak, is like, we're not just going to talk theory. We're going to go in and like do it. And I think when teachers get to see their own students that maybe had seemed apathetic, now suddenly engaged, or that maybe they didn't think would want to write that much or read that much or talk that much or do whatever, suddenly they are. Suddenly they're engaged, and just from starting the lesson with a question and offering like some choice, like something that simple. It can seem like small tweaks, and they see this whole shift in their environment. I think that's where then, as an educator, you're like, well, I want more of that. Like, yeah, let's do whatever we need to do to have more of that, but you have to see it. I think if we only just talk about it, it's just what we were saying. We're kind of circling back to where we started. Like we said with kids, they experience it. Like so do we as teachers who are always learning and outgrowing ourselves. So all of that's to say, I think the biggest transformation comes when, just like we want for children, everything we say we believe for children, like do we believe it for ourselves? Because that means teachers need time to live the inquiry interplay of asking and trying, doing, reflecting, thinking. Like they need that time. And if we don't give that time and space for them to really live it, in a brains on way and engage and do it and try it, it's probably just going to float away. The one day workshop, you'll spark. Yeah. Like anytime I do that, like I'll throw some sparks and there'll be some seeds. But unless that teacher was already super motivated because it was their own personal interest or what have you, it's probably going to float away, just like we would see with students at a younger age. The times when it sticks and takes root and transforms is when they get to live their own inquiry and live the learning and try and make mistakes and have a coach there to reflect on their mistakes and all of that.
Yeah. I guess we're starting now to prioritize skills, right? For example, even in the Australian curriculum, there are outcomes that teachers have to meet in terms of skills that we're teaching children. and this whole thing about adaptability and collaboration. Where do you see that there's a future for inquiry going forward? Because when you listen to things like, John Hattie, for example, saying in high impact teaching strategies that inquiry doesn't work and kids aren't performing well and it's really a waste of time and it doesn't make any impact on children's learning. Is there a future for inquiry going forward? I mean, I think there is, and obviously all of those educators and people like yourself who've experienced it and lived it know that there is. But what do we say to the naysayers?
Yeah, so I really appreciate John Hattie's work, and I lean on a lot of his research and work for how we support agency, actually, and that students can be self-assessors, self-adjusters, and really have agency ownership of their learning. But there's a great video clip. I'll send it to you because maybe we can add it with like the link to the pod from John Hattie. And he talks about this very thing you're describing, where really the reason why, what he believes from the research he's done so far, that the reason why inquiry is often seen as less impact than some of these other high impact moves is he thinks the studies, the meta-analyses they brought together, it's that inquiry hasn't been done well. If you're doing inquiry well, he says if you're doing inquiry well, it could be quite different. And so he talks a lot about, and I do a lot of work with this with teams I work with too, of do we design, again, going back to that being intentional, do we design a unit or bend a section of a unit with the spiral of surface, deep, and transfer learning in mind? So it kind of goes back to that just in time, not just in case. When inquiry is seen as not impactful, it's when we're actually not doing just in time explicit teaching and we're not doing some surface learning. We're just throwing kids in. We're throwing eggs in the water, right? If we go back to that proverb, we're like, all right, we're going to like explore this. Off you go explore. And I'll just kind of be here. We also talk a lot about how that's the difference between being a facilitator and being an activator. So trying to move from a misunderstanding of, oh, as teacher, we're just facilitator, which isn't a bad thing. I think that term started in a good way, but it's sometimes misunderstood for where teachers think, as long as I just have the materials, I facilitated, I created the activity and the materials, off you go. Instead, no, you have a huge role and a huge impact as a teacher. Like good teachers matter. So you need to be there as an activator. And so if you're in the midst of the learning, in the midst of the inquiry, your brain's on and hands on with the kids, you're meeting with small groups and coaching in, you're coaching one-on-one and conferring one-on-one. Like if you're doing that, like when kids go off to live the work and to live the learning, you can't be, checking your emails or hanging things up on the wall just because, oh, they're all like learning, they're engaged, so I'll just go do this other stuff. No, that's when you're doing your most powerful teaching. So I think this mix of understanding that inquiry can be very, very powerful pedagogy, and there's plenty of research to back that up. However, as with probably any pedagogies, it has to be done well. And so to make sure you do plan, kind of think of your unit as a journey, as a storyline. And so do you teach them initial surface learning so that children can go deep? And so that children can transfer. Because if you don't have the surface learning, they probably will just be eggs in the water and they're not going to learn. And those are going to be the studies where it's like, oh, this wasn't effective. They didn't walk away with a lot of knowledge and understanding and skills. So that I think would be one big piece. And then on the skills end of things, I think not all schools I work with are IB, but a lot of them are. And we talk a lot about approaches to learning skills, ATL skills, which are like critical thinking skills, creative thinking skills, communication skills, social skills. And that those are really important too. And I think inquiry just helps that all the more. Inquiry, if you have to go off and live the learning, you're going to have to collaborate and communicate and think. And so you're building those skills. And in this day and age, especially, I think that's really important. There's you've probably seen by our conversation, I love my quotes. I'm a big quote collector. There's a quote on from years ago, actually. I know that AI is like the big thing right now, artificial intelligence, but this quote is from like over a decade ago, I believe. And the author says, we're so worried that machines will start thinking like humans, but we should be worried instead that humans might start thinking like machines.
Machine.
And it was like, oh, touche, like mic dropped, like it's true. And I feel like if we're not teaching in an inquiry rich way, we've already seen it happen. There's a lot of young adults that go out into the world and they're just thinking like a machine, like, tell me what to do and I'll do it. You tell me what to do and I'll do it. But other than that, I don't think on my own at all, and then you think from a larger society lens. I mean, things like social media, like Facebook or whatever, like people will just reshare posts that you're like, how in the world could they think this is true? Like I'll see people share something that is clearly not true information, like something ridiculous. Like to you and me, we think that's ridiculous. Why would they share that? And they're sharing it wholeheartedly, thinking it's true. Like they didn't exercise their critical thinking. You know what I mean? They believe if they see it, if someone puts it out there, it must be true, right? And so like that, those are the skills we really need to teach: is critical thinking, creative thinking, thinking for yourself, investigating, so that they're not just going off and rotely thinking like machines, but they're thinking like a human.
Before we started recording, Tonya and I were having a long chat before we actually pressed the record button. And we were talking about my sons who've just now started the workforce and they finished their degrees. But what we didn't say, Tonya, what I didn't share was that everything that they did in their degree with those skills that we actually teach in inquiry. It's not anymore that you just sit in a little room and you study and then you regurgitate it. Almost every single thing they did was through collaboration, was required them to work with others. It required them to do research. It required them to write lengthy reports. It required critical thinking. It required analysis of data. And to me, whenever they shared what they were doing with me, I always thought, gosh, that's exactly inquiry. When we talk about preparing children for the future and having the skills to navigate a future, it's only those inquiry skills that we learn whilst we're doing it, whilst we're in there, knee deep, elbow deep in that process. That's what's going to stand kids in good stead for the future. So I think that was pretty pertinent because I've seen it sort of firsthand myself in terms of the skills that kids are using in the future, which is really now and going forward, are those skills of collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, really important. Tonya, this has been an amazing conversation and I've just absolutely loved it. And so my last question to you is, how do you stay curious?
There's probably a few ways, but my biggest one is I do love to read. I think I mentioned that in passing earlier.
Yes.
Like I'm such a reader. So for me, I prefer like versus, not that I don't sometimes watch videos or listen to different, lectures or things like that as ways to learn or take courses and, all of that, done all of that, still do all of that. But my biggest way that keeps me curious is I just like kind of voraciously read. Now, I do love, of course, reading fiction and things like that, light reads for fun. But as an educator and from a professional lens, I'm always reading like professional reads. And I think like just reading and also reading the research as well. One of my favorite things to do is if I really like a professional read, I go to the back of the book, where they list all of their resources and the studies they leaned on, to then go read the studies myself. And because that, I think, can be really just fascinating to see, first of all, that sometimes, unfortunately, studies get taken out of context. So again, we ourselves have to use those critical thinking skills and be like, oh, well, that's not actually what this was saying. Other times it just leads you to just, new knowledge. So I think just that reading widely and deeply, I think helps a lot too, because then you see there's not one way. Like, I think the biggest thing that keeps me curious is like, I really, really have experienced myself that there's not one way. And so I'm never going to feel like, oh, well, this is the one way. You must do it this way. Even with core values, like a core value, as we've discussed today, is I do believe in honoring agency, and I do believe in living inquiry. But I also know there's not one way to do that, that there's different ways that can look at each school and each country and each context. And so I think that naturally helps keep me curious because there's always more to learn. I don't think I could ever be done learning, and just learning of different ways and different perspectives and different things. So, I think just thankful to have had the experiences of seeing there's not one way, because I do feel like that changed a lot. If I think back to when I grew up, like growing up in a small town, in the US, the world, it seemed like there were just only a certain few set of ways. But then the more you travel and the more you visit and the more you experience and the different people you meet, you see that no, definitely not one way. And I'm so thankful for that. And then just reading. Love to read. So that's my biggest way to kind of keep growing my curiosity.
Amazing. Tonya, thanks for coming on to Blooming Curious today. We've had such a fabulous chat, and I hope that everybody who listens today really takes away so many fantastic, deep gems from you, because you're just such an incredible educator and an incredible teacher, not just to children, but to educators all over the world. So thank you for the work that you do. And thanks for being here today. I so appreciate it.